1. The morning of the 15th of January, 1947, a woman walking with her daughter through a vacant lot in Los Angeles noticed something in the grass. She thought it was a discarded store mannequin. She looked closer. It was a body. A young woman, 22 years old, had been placed in that lot with surgical precision. Her body had been completely drained of blood. She had been cut in half at the waist. Her face had been slashed from the corners of her mouth toward her ears, in what investigators would later describe as a Glasgow smile. Her skin had been scrubbed clean. Her body had been posed, deliberately and carefully, as if arranged for display. There was not a single drop of blood anywhere at the scene. Whoever had done this had not killed her here. They had killed her somewhere else, cleaned her, and then carried her to this lot, and placed her exactly where she would be found. The woman's name was Elizabeth Short. She was an aspiring actress who had come to Los Angeles looking for a life that never arrived. The newspapers, in the sensationalist style of the era, called her the Black Dahlia. The name came from a noir film that had been playing in theaters that month, and from the dark clothing she was known to wear. But here is what the newspapers did not fully report. Here is what most people who know this case do not know. The killer did not disappear after the murder. He stayed. He reached out. He sent letters and packages to the police and newspapers, taunting investigators, sending them pieces of evidence, and daring them to catch him. Those letters were coded, they were constructed, and they were the work of someone who was not just a killer, but a performer who needed an audience. The Black Dahlia case was never solved, but the letters the killer left behind are still readable today, and they tell us more about who this person was than 75 years of investigation has been able to confirm. This is Shadow Cipher Files, and this is the case of the coded letters nobody was meant to decode. Elizabeth Short was born in Boston in 1924. She grew up during the Depression, the third of 5 daughters, with a father who faked his own death to escape financial ruin and eventually abandoned the family entirely. She spent parts of her childhood in Massachusetts and parts in California, following the warmth the way many people did during those years. By the time she was in her early 20s, Elizabeth Short had drifted into the margins of Hollywood. She was beautiful in a way that drew attention, dark-haired and pale-skinned, with an instinct for presentation. She wanted to be in the movies. She worked as a waitress and in snack bars near military bases, moving between Miami and Los Angeles and back again, accumulating a social circle of men who bought her dinners and women who let her stay on their couches. She was not, despite what the tabloid version of her story implies, a woman of any particular notoriety. She was young and broke, and trying to figure out how to become someone in a city that consumed that exact type of person without hesitation. In the last weeks of her life, Elizabeth Short was staying with various acquaintances in the Los Angeles area. She was last seen alive on the 9th of January 1947, when a man named Robert Manley drove her to the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. She walked into the lobby. She was never seen alive again. 6 days later, she was found in that vacant lot on Norton Avenue in the Leimert Park neighborhood. Between January 9th and January 15, something had happened to Elizabeth Short that left her body without a single drop of blood and cut precisely in half with what the coroner determined was a surgical or very sharp-bladed instrument. The Los Angeles Police Department had a murder. They had no suspect, and they were about to discover that the killer had no intention of staying quiet. Within days of the murder becoming public, the Los Angeles Examiner received a phone call. The caller claimed to be the killer. He said he wanted the police to have some souvenirs of Beth Short. He said he would be sending them. Several days later, a package arrived at the newspaper's offices. It had been assembled with deliberate care. The items inside had been wiped clean with gasoline, a method that investigators recognized as an attempt to remove fingerprints and trace evidence. Inside the package were Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, her social security card, photographs, her address book, and a baggage claim check for a suitcase that was later recovered from a bus depot. And on the outside of the package, assembled from letters cut from newspapers and magazines in the style of an anonymous ransom note, were the words, "First installment." First installment. Not a one-time communication. A series. The killer was announcing a correspondence. Over the following weeks, additional letters and communications arrived at the Examiner and at the Los Angeles Police Department. Each one taunted investigators. Each one revealed just enough to prove the sender had knowledge of the crime, while withholding the specific details that would lead to identification. Each one was constructed with that same newspaper cutout lettering, deliberate and theatrical. One letter read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." Another said, "Have changed my mind. You would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." Another, "I am watching your move." And then one more, in a communication that sent investigators in a direction they would spend decades following. "Want terms. Will give up." The coded nature of these letters goes beyond the obvious theatrical choice of newspaper cutout text. What investigators at the time, and researchers in the decades since, have found when analyzing these communications is a pattern of deliberate information control that is itself a form of encoding. Each letter reveals something and conceals something else in precise proportion. Enough to prove authenticity, not enough to enable identification. This balance is not accidental. It requires thought. It requires someone who understood what investigators could and could not do with information in 1947, and who calibrated every communication accordingly. The letter saying Dahlia killing was justified is particularly significant. This was not a boast about power. This was a justification. The killer felt, or needed the world to feel, that Elizabeth Short had done something to deserve what happened to her. This single phrase tells investigators something about the psychology of the person who wrote it. They needed moral authorization. They needed a frame in which what they had done made sense. This is the behavioral cipher inside the written cipher. Not just what the letters say, but what the letters need. And what these letters need, consistently, across every communication, is recognition. Acknowledgement. An audience that takes the sender seriously. The first installment framing was not random. It was a declaration that this communication had value, that more would follow if the audience responded appropriately. That the sender was not simply someone who had committed a crime, but someone who had something to offer, something to say, a relationship to establish with the outside world. The same psychology that drove the Zodiac to send coded letters. The same psychology that drove BTK to mail packages to television stations. The same deep need to be known, to be seen, to be understood as someone significant. The Black Dahlia killer, whoever they were, shared this psychology, and in 1947, they were operating it in a media environment that was perfectly designed to amplify exactly that kind of performance. The investigation into Elizabeth Short's murder was, by any measure, one of the most chaotic and mismanaged in Los Angeles Police Department history. This is not a criticism of individual investigators, so much as an acknowledgement of the institutional failure that allowed the case to remain unsolved. In the weeks following the murder, the LAPD received over 150 confessions. People walked into police stations claiming to have killed Elizabeth Short. Some were clearly mentally ill. Some were attention seekers. Some were people with specific knowledge that required careful evaluation. The task of sorting genuine leads from the noise of the confessions consumed enormous investigative resources at exactly the moment when the actual killer was actively communicating. The letters continued to arrive. The LAPD continued to receive them. And somewhere in those letters, buried in the calibrated information control and the theatrical newspaper cutout text, was the actual identity of the person who had killed Elizabeth Short. But the investigation never got there. Suspects were considered and eliminated. Over the decades since 1947, more than 500 individuals have been named as suspects in various investigations, books, documentaries, and personal accounts. Some of these theories are coherent and evidence-based. Most are not. The case has attracted a particular kind of obsession that sometimes produces genuine insight and often produces noise. What has never wavered, across all of those decades and all of those theories, is the physical evidence of the letters. They exist. They were received. They were written by someone who had genuine knowledge of the crime. And despite everything that has been thrown at this case in 75 years, those letters have never been conclusively attributed to any specific individual. There is a detail about the Black Dahlia letters that most discussions of this case skip over, and it is the detail that matters most to understanding them as coded communication. The use of newspaper cutout lettering was not just a precaution against handwriting identification. It was a choice that carried meaning. In 1947, newspaper cutout lettering was strongly associated in the public imagination with ransom notes. It was a visual vocabulary that people recognized from films and crime reporting. By using that specific format, the killer was not just hiding their identity. They were placing this communication within a specific genre. They were signaling that this was a negotiation, that something could be exchanged, that terms could be set. The letter that said, "Want terms, will give up," is the most explicit expression of this. The killer was performing the role of someone who could be bargained with, someone who had leverage, someone who was in control of whether this would continue. This was almost certainly a performance, rather than a genuine offer. The killer had no intention of giving themselves up. But the performance of having something to offer, of being in a position to negotiate, was psychologically essential. It maintained the fiction of control. It extended the relationship with the audience. It kept the communication alive. Every decision in those letters, the format, the phrasing, the timing, the content balance of revealing and concealing, was in service of one core objective. The killer needed to remain significant. The murder itself was not enough. The recognition of the murder, the ongoing acknowledgement by police and media and public that the person who had done this was still present and still watching, was the actual goal. In 1949, 2 years after the murder, a man named Leslie Dillon was investigated by the LAPD as a serious suspect. He had knowledge of the case that was difficult to explain. He had connections to the environment Elizabeth Short had moved through. He was investigated, and then released, and the investigation was quietly dropped. In 2003, a retired LAPD detective named Steve Hodel published a book arguing that his own father, Dr. George Hodel, was the Black Dahlia killer. George Hodel had been a suspect in 1950. He had been recorded by the LAPD, making statements that investigators found deeply suspicious. He had fled to Asia shortly after that investigation and never returned to the United States to live. Steve Hodel spent years building a case against his father that was detailed enough to be taken seriously by former law enforcement professionals, though it has never been confirmed or prosecuted. Other theories have pointed to Walter Bailey, a doctor who lived near the dump site, to Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner Elizabeth Short knew, to Jack Anderson Wilson, a transient with a violent history who died in a hotel fire before investigators could question him fully. None of these theories has produced a conclusion. None of them has broken open the letters in a way that definitively connects a specific person to the specific knowledge encoded within them. The Black Dahlia case remains, as of today, officially unsolved. No arrest has ever been made. No prosecution has ever been brought. What can we actually conclude about the person who wrote those letters based on the letters themselves? Forensic linguistic analysis of the communications, applied decades after the fact by researchers who have studied the case, suggests several consistent characteristics. The writer had above-average intelligence. The calibration of information, the balance of revealing and concealing, the theatrical staging of each communication, these require planning and self-awareness that go beyond ordinary criminal behavior. The writer had familiarity with how investigations worked, the gasoline cleaning of evidence before mailing, the knowledge of what fingerprint evidence could reveal, the understanding of how to construct communications that could not be easily traced. This familiarity suggests either professional exposure to law enforcement or serious study of investigative methodology. The writer needed external validation in an unusually intense way. The volume of communications, the theatrical framing, the ongoing relationship with media and police, these go far beyond what is necessary for someone who simply wants to avoid capture. This person wanted to be part of the story. They wanted ongoing acknowledgement of their significance. The writer felt justified. The phrase "Dahlia killing" was justified. The framing of the murder as something that had been earned or deserved suggests a belief system in which the victim bore responsibility for what happened to her. This moral reframing is a classic element of a specific type of violent psychology. Taken together, these characteristics describe someone who was educated, organized, self-aware, connected to the world of law enforcement or medicine in some professional capacity, deeply narcissistic, and operating in Los Angeles in early 1947 with the resources and knowledge to commit and then methodically stage a crime of this complexity. That description does not identify a single person, but it eliminates a very large number of the theories that have been proposed over 75 years. The last known letter attributed to the Black Dahlia killer arrived at the Los Angeles Examiner in March 1947, approximately 2 months after the murder. After that, the communications stopped. Whether the killer died, moved away, was incarcerated for an unrelated offense, or simply decided that the audience was no longer worth performing for, is unknown. The silence after March 1947 is itself a kind of final communication. It says, "I am done with this. Whatever I needed from this exchange, I have taken it. The relationship is over on my terms, not yours." Elizabeth Short was 22 years old. She had been in Los Angeles for a short time. She had done nothing to earn what happened to her, regardless of what any letter may have claimed. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who had a specific laugh and specific opinions about the world and specific hopes for her own future. The case that bears her name has become a cultural phenomenon, a fixture of Los Angeles noir mythology, a reference point for the darkest intersection of beauty and violence and ambition that the city represents. But underneath all of that mythology is a young woman who was killed and whose killer was never held accountable. The letters exist. The evidence exists. And somewhere, in the coded balance of what was revealed and what was concealed across those weeks of communication in early 1947, the answer probably still exists too. It has just never been fully read. If this case has stayed with you, I want to ask you something directly. Of all the suspects who have been named over 75 years, and I have only touched on a few of them tonight, which theory do you find most credible? Leave your answer in the comments. Not just the name, but why. What is it about the specific evidence that points you in that direction? Because I think the most interesting thing about the Black Dahlia case is not the mystery of who did it. It is the question of why we have never been able to close it. Whether that is a failure of investigation, a failure of evidence, or something in the nature of the killer's coded communications that has kept us perpetually one step away from an answer. Subscribe to Shadow Cipher Files if you want to keep going into cases where the evidence contains a hidden layer, where the crime is the surface and the code is the depth. Next week we are going into a case involving a ransom note so unusual that it divided an entire investigation and has never been resolved. The handwriting experts disagree. The language experts disagree, and the family at the center of it has never had an answer. This is Shadow Cipher Files. The letters are real, the case is open, and the killer is still out there somewhere, or was, walking through a world that never knew what they had done. I will see you next week.